fertilize our soil and get better, hopefully get better yields. AJ?
Well, yes, I thought I'd run off everybody. I'm going to talk about agronomy of alfalfa, but I'm going to talk mainly from the soil's perspective. My background is soil fertility, so I'm going to talk mainly from a soil perspective. And for me, they have this saying, you know, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. So for me, you know, soils guy, every problem looks like a fertility problem. So when I walk into a field, the first question is about soil fertility. And so I'm going to kind of talk a little bit from that perspective. So I want to start with this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes. It says, "You can't fix a plant, you simply give it the right condition to flourish. The key is to know what those conditions are." And so that's kind of what my presentation is going to be. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these conditions that that plant needs to flourish. And but before I go, let's talk about alfalfa production in general. And the first thing with alfalfa production, and pretty much any crop production system, is you got to have a realistic goal. You have to set realistic goals based on your environment, based on your soils, based on the varieties, just based on your own management system, what equipment you have and all that. You got to set a realistic goal. Sometimes we can't say I'm going to further look to make 8 tons when in that whole area nobody has ever made over 4 tons. So we have to really set realistic goals. That's the first way we got to start. And our goal is always to increase production efficiency. So we want to always to produce more with less. And we're doing a better job with equipment and a lot of even our new varieties to produce more with less. And that's what we're really trying to do. And in a lot of our production systems, a lot of it start with our variety selection. And we selecting the right variety. We want to make sure we have the right variety that matches our soil, matches our environment. And a lot of times we often tend to select based on high yields. But we also got to pay attention to disease package and that aspect as well, not just yield. Because based on your environment, sometimes your best yield is going to come from what package the variety package that has good disease resistance. Because if you have a high potential with diseases, that should be one of your top priorities. Next we talk about fertility management, and which that's what I predominantly focus on, would be fertility management and the importance of soil testing and importance of understanding those fertility requirements. And in managing stand, everything starts from that establishment. You got to focus on that establishment. A good established stand, when you have a good established stand, you're way ahead of the game. A poor established stand, you're already way behind. You're playing catch up. So it's best to really put a lot into that establishment. You want to invest in that establishment, getting a good stand first. And then pest control management, and that's important in terms of making sure you're protecting whatever stand you have and protecting that crop. So let's look at the plant factory. I like to see the plant as a factory. So it's a factory where you have inputs and outputs. So in that plant factory, you got your inputs, your sunlight, your carbon dioxide, your nutrients, your water. All these are inputs that comes in. And the plant takes all these and it makes a product. And so most plants, its output is either going to be a starch product or it's going to be a nitrogen product, protein. So it's either making starch or protein. Or cereal grain, predominantly, they're more starch-based product. Or legume crops are mostly protein-based. So our plant requirement then depends on the final product. The final product it produces is going to determine its requirement. So if it's a grain crop that produces a lot of starch, its requirement is a lot less than a crop that produces, a leguminous crop that produces protein. And a lot of that is due to what that final product is. If we look at starch, if you look, it's a ring structure, but compared to protein, you got these double bonds. And to make that double bond takes a lot of energy. So that plant needs a lot of nutrients, in order to make that protein. And that's why predominantly when we look at our leguminous crop like soybeans or alfalfa, we typically associate them with high fertility requirement because of the final product that they produce. Compared to our cereal grains or corn and our grasses, their requirement is a lot less. because they're producing mostly a starchy product, which requires a little less energy to do that. So I always compare it to a little bitty car versus a dually pickup truck. So that's kind of what it is. A legume is really that dually pickup truck, and your cereal grains is your little bitty car. So that's one way for you to think of it is always, so in terms of, a lot of times you look at it, and a lot of farmers make this mistake a lot of time. I make 200 bushels on my corn, I make 50 bushels on my soybean. So that means my corn needs a lot more nutrients than my soybean. But it's actually the reverse. To make that 50 bushels of soybeans actually takes more nutrients than to make the 200 bushels of corn. So sometimes we gotta be mindful of that because the requirement is a lot higher to make that protein. So if we look at alfalfa and looking at its uptake and its removal, in terms of its removal, we see alfalfa have a high demand for nutrients. And so that's why we often think of alfalfa, we think of fertility requirement. You gotta have a pH above 6. It needs a lot of P, it needs a lot of K, it needs magnesium, it needs sulfur. So we see here its requirements are pretty high. What's interesting if we look, and we're going to refer to this later, if we look at its potassium requirement and its nitrogen requirement removal rate, they're almost identical. And that's because it's a balancing. It's a balancing act of a K plus and an NO3 minus. It's trying to balance those as it uptake those nutrients. Look at its calcium requirement. It's also pretty high. A lot of calcium is needed on our legume crops, and that's important for nodulation. And a big part of any crop production system is the root development. You got to have good root development. And alfalfa, a lot of alfalfa, because a lot of the regrowth comes from the crown of the root crown. So it needs good, well-established root development. And so when you think of lateral roots and the deep roots, the first year early establishment, you're going to have a lot of lateral roots. As it ages, you get a lot more deeper roots in that system, in that alfalfa stand. Then you have a root density. There's two different root systems between a cereal, when you think of a cereal grain versus a alfalfa. One is a tap root system, one is a fibrous root system. So you see we got your root densities are a lot higher in that fibrous and that grass type crop versus that legume, but that's a lot deeper root system. So it has a much deeper root system, but it's not, the density is a lot lower in the surface. And again, fertilizer application is very critical for increasing root growth. So you want to maintain good fertility also to enhance your root growth. Temperature effect on nutrients uptake. Temperature plays a big role in terms of nutrients uptake because you want that temperature is important for that nutrient cycle because you need that, the microbes operate, needs that warm temperature for those microbes to start to break down your organics and making that nutrient cycling goes. So that's where it's very important. So slow nutrient release from organic matter, because when the soil is cold, those microbes, they take a longer time to start to break down that soil, that organic matter to make those nutrients available. So predominantly your nitrogen and your sulfur that are a big part of your organic matter will be a lot less available in a colder soil. Reduce the fusion of nutrients to roots, and that's also because of that slower nutrient cycling. And it hinders root absorption and translocation because you have less nutrients and you have a slower nutrient cycling. So predominantly cooler temperature, you're going to have higher levels of nutrients are needed to support vigorous growth. So if you're planting early, that's where that starter really helps in a cooler soil. You want that starter fertilizer in there with those seeds to actually help provide that nutrients early. Soil pH, one of those conditions, and I'm going to talk about some of those conditions, like soil pH. I always see soil pH like a cooling system in your car. So if you think of your cooling system in your car and what it does is it's kind of like temperature, because your cooling system monitor the temperature in that car. And it's a condition and not a cause of many, so soil pH is a condition and not a cause of many reactions. So what is it really doing? It regulates, just like your cooling system in your car, it regulates the whole system. So the pH it regulates chemical and biological activity. So it's what regulates to ensure nutrient cycling and microbial activity are operating at optimal. Same thing with the cooling system in your car. it ensures that that engine operates at optimum performance. Your cooling system goes down, you don't get very far. And even though, so that's kind of the same with pH in the soil. If pH gets too low, you don't really, the crop production really gets hurt pretty significantly. So looking at alfalfa's response to pH, and we see on this chart here, on our y-axis we got yields in ton, on our x-axis we got soil pH. And what we see is as soil pH increase, we kind of see that increase in our yields. And we get to about that 6.5 range, we get up there, we're starting to see pretty much a leveling off. So we started, that's kind of the pH where alfalfa operates pretty much at optimum, around that 6.5 range. This is another study that looks at liming and acidic soils and looking at its response in terms of alfalfa yields. So we look at alfalfa yields and we look at different rates of lime added and looking at it over 3 years. And what you see is, we look at it in relation to pH. As that pH increase, we see those yields increase as well. So we're seeing a real strong response to that pH levels. And in terms of nutrients availability, we also see in terms of nutrients availability, looking at alfalfa shoot composition and looking at NK and calcium uptake, what we see as pH, looking at the 3 pH range, we're starting to see nutrients uptake actually starting to increase with that pH as well. So we're getting a real increase in...
From 6 on it to 7, do you see any value going up above 6.1?
Once you get 6.5 is that optimal range, and to start getting beyond that, we're not, it's kind of levels out.
What pH does it start back down? High.
In terms of high pH, you see start coming back down. I haven't looked at that though, but when you start getting into that 7 and start getting higher, I won't say it would go back down, but your management, you're going to require a lot more, probably need more water that on the irrigation and those conditions needed to really get it to really produce. That's why under our high pH soils, we can produce pretty good yields with water. You take the water away, it doesn't do very well because it needs that hydrogen ions in that system to really get it to go. Because those hydrogen in a soil is what you call, it's like money. It's the exchanger. So the hydrogen is what's been exchanged for the cations and making them become available. So when you get the hydrogen in the system, you start getting more nutrients becoming exchanged and you're getting that available. As your pH gets high, because pH, you get more OH. And so when you get more OH is not an exchanger, so you're not getting much nutrients available. And that's what, until you start to get that hydrogen in the system to actually increase the amount of your nutrients become available. So the next condition would be nitrogen. And when we think of legume and we think of nitrogen, we think of input is biological fixation. So we know most legumes tend to fix their own nitrogen. And we got to wonder why they do that is their demand for nitrogen is pretty high. So that's one reason they fixed it, because they make it that way because their demand is so high for that nitrogen. So they fix it to a symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the plant. But what we got to remember, that end fixation is not free. It's really not free because it requires a lot of energy. So it requires a lot of energy. So that plant actually would rather take up nitrogen from the soil than actually fix. So if you have high nitrogen in the soil, the legume is going to use the nitrogen in the soil and it's not going to fix any nitrogen. Because it's really going to take the easiest route. And the easiest route is to use that nitrogen in the soil. And so that's something, that's why when we think of legume establishment, we think of, most recommendation doesn't call for nitrogen fertilization because of that aspect, because that legume is going to use the nitrogen that's available and it won't fix its own. And we want it to fix its own and save up, put money in our pocket and use its own natural system to do that. So we got to remember that microbes obtain energy from carbohydrates. So that's kind of the trade system between the plants and the legumes, is that the plant provides the carbohydrates and the legume, and then the microbes fix the nitrogen to supply the plant. So they kind of have a little symbiotic trade relationship there. And photosynthetic drive carbohydrates from the plant. So that plant has to be photosynthesizing in order to produce that carbohydrate, and it trades some with the microbes, and then the microbes provide that nitrogen. Next nutrient is phosphorus. Phosphorus, we'll spend a little more time talking on phosphorus. When we think of phosphorus, a lot of times we think of phosphorus and its availability. Most times, think of phosphorus, the next thing is the availability of phosphorus. And phosphorus is always a tricky nutrient in terms of that, because phosphorus is a type of nutrient I like to see it as one that I really don't like to be alone. It likes a companion. So that's most times it puts phosphorus in the soil. If it gets close to with calcium or aluminum, iron, it just likes to bind with something. So you get it in there, it really gets to bind with something. But phosphorus is an important nutrient for legumes like alfalfa production. It's important for photosynthesis, because it's a big part of photosynthesis by the chlorophyll. And it's biochemical synthesis of organic matter. So you put organic matter is phosphorus tend to, if you have high organic matter levels, you tend to have more phosphorus available. Because as that organic breaks down, you get those organic acids that makes a lot of that phosphorus much more available than when you don't have that organic matter. So we see ample organic matter in the soil is pretty important for phosphorus availability. It's also very important in proteinaceous composition, and that's why we'll see for alfalfa it requires a high amount of phosphorus because it has high protein levels. So phosphorus is important to help it having that high protein levels. And phosphorus is very, very strongly related to pH. So based on because that pH tells you, I like to describe it like this with soil pH. You got three guys that really wants to run the show in the soil. You have your aluminum, your calcium, and your sodium. So if aluminum is running the show when you have a lower pH, aluminum is a small atom, so it doesn't like to share anything. So when you get aluminum in the soil, you don't get a lot of nutrients becoming available because that aluminum doesn't like to share. Calcium is a good guy. It likes to share, and it mobilizes uptake of other nutrients. And that's why calcium really helps to really make a lot of nutrients available. Sodium, on the other hand, is a bigger atom. And when you start getting sodium levels too high, it's so big it just destroys the whole system. So that's when you get in your acidic soils and your soil structure and all that start to deteriorate with that high levels of sodium. And so, but calcium is always a good friend. But if it start getting too high, it can be a problem in itself. So looking at phosphorus, the ability of plant to move phosphorus, phosphorus gets into the plant by diffusion. So that's why most times when we talk about phosphorus and its movement, if that root is close to where that phosphorus is, that's why we talk about banding phosphorus, it's close to it, so it moves from the area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So it's easier to get that diffusion process going as the root gets close to it, and you get more phosphorus uptake into that plant. So looking at pea fertilization on its effect on nodulation, the number of nodules versus looking at soil water holding capacity and different concentration of phosphorus on this chart. And what we see here is that as phosphorus levels increase, the number of nodules also increase. So it's important in terms of the nodulation in the legumes, having those nodules to fix that nitrogen. Also, alfalfa responds to added phosphorus fertilizers, looking at total 3 years yield in terms of tonnage, and looking at soil test phosphorus at about 8 ppm. So that's a low level soil phosphorus right there. And what we're seeing is pretty good response to phosphorus, to levels of phosphorus at 225 pounds of P2O5. And so what we see, yield response to added phosphorus is evidence in the first cutting. But with soil pea fertility was maintained by small application of large one-time application. So with building phosphorus, you can do it in small increments if you're starting at low, or you could put all of it all at one time and build up to that critical levels, that maintenance level that you want to be at. Another aspect is phosphorus improves alfalfa growth and recovery. So you have adequate amount of phosphorus, then what you realize is looking at shoot weight, milligrams per plant, and look at day after cutting, and looking at your phosphorus levels, what you see as you have higher levels of phosphorus in that plant, the recovery after cutting is a lot faster than when you have low levels of phosphorus. Now, you also see, looking at, in terms of alfalfa develop more shoots after cutting when it has adequate phosphorus. So see that phosphorus is really important in that system.
At lunch, they talked about manure and manure type, generally high in phosphorus. Is that the type of phosphorus that's available to alfalfa?
Yes, the manure phosphorus will be available to alfalfa. I mean, you're looking at, because within manure you have both organic and inorganic type phosphorus. So you're going to have a good bit of that phosphorus will be available the first year. And then the organic slow release later on. The potassium. Potassium is I consider potassium the workhorse. And it's a workhorse nutrient because it functions in carbohydrate production. And so it's really important when we talked about earlier, the plant has a trading relationship, right, with the microbes. And what does it provide? Carbohydrates. So it provides the microbes with carbohydrates, and the microbes help it to fix nitrogen. So potassium is a big part of helping the plant to produce that carbohydrate. Potassium is also known as poor manure irrigation. Most times in drought condition, you want high levels of potassium because it makes that plant a lot more resistant to dealing with dry condition. And the higher the end, more K is needed to do the job. And when we looked at one of the first slides in terms of removal, we see almost equal amount of P and potassium and nitrogen was required. So as you increase your nitrogen rate, that potassium is needed in higher rate as well, because it's a balancing between those negative and positive charge. And potassium is important to reduce lodging, tend to increase potassium levels to increase lodging, reduce lodging, but some of your micros, like your copper and your manganese, are also important. And a lot of times we kind of forget our micros a lot of time, but they're also important in the system. So again, looking at nodulation, and I focus a lot because potassium nodulation is really important in our legume system because that's really what provides that nitrogen and for that protein production. So if we look at nodule numbers and look at nodule weight and look at different levels of K2O added, and what we see is as potassium levels increase, we also see an increase in our number of nodules on that legume. Hay quality as well. If we look at it in terms of hay quality and looking at our potassium, we look at leaf drops, leaf spot rating, and leaf to stem ratio, and we see with leaf drop decrease as our potassium levels increase, and leaf spot rating decrease with potassium levels, while our leaf to stem ratio increase as we increase that potassium levels in that plant. It helps to reduce winter kill. So a big part of is that persistence of that stand. This is where money is made, is the persistence of that stand. And potassium is really important in that persistence of that stand. This is an older study that was done back in the 70s, looking at stand density. And when we look at no potassium added versus 100 pounds of K2O per year, and we look at it pretty much maintain that stand for a lot longer period than when we didn't have that potassium levels. So potassium is very important that's where the money is made, is that persistent. But there's always a drawback. You can have luxury uptake, so we say a little is good, then we just go too much. Too much potassium, you can have that luxury uptake of potassium. And that, especially in dairy cattle, can be a problem. And so what we like to see is potassium in alfalfa should be between less than 1.5% and no greater than 3%. So that's the range we're really looking at if we do our leaf sample. So luxury uptake when soil K is very high. So you don't want, when soil K gets high, you can get that luxury uptake. A plant will luxury feed on that potassium, and that can be a problem. So if you get K levels above 3%, you don't want that's kind of unnecessary, and that could be a problem.
What problem does it present? I'm
going to talk about it, So concerned with, so you get too high levels, then you can have, for your dry cows, dairy cows, can lead to milk fever, reduced placenta, after calving, and from transitioning to 2 to 4 weeks before calving, forage with less than 2% K. Desires and dietary K should be about less than 1.2%. But when you get to your grains, like your corn, silage, your grain, your distiller grain, those are low K feed. Anybody knows why? We talked about that. Their requirements are a lot lower, so they're going to be a lot lower in potassium levels. But if you have that problem, there's anionic salts like chlorides or the sulfates or ammonium, even magnesium or calcium can be inputted into the system to help you with that problem if you have high levels of potassium. So there are tools to help you to deal with that problem if you have that problem. But another thing with high potassium levels is that high potassium will compete with other cations for plant uptake. And that is, in the soil, there's always a battle between the nutrients. The K plus being just with one nutrients with just a positive charge, one positive K plus, tends to be a lot more competitive than nutrients like your 2 plus. So potassium will always outcompete your calcium and your magnesium in terms of uptake, because because just having that K plus charge make it a lot more competitive. And so if we look at tissue magnesium levels and look at K applied, we're starting to see that as K levels increase, we see a decrease in that magnesium levels in that plant. So that potassium can really outcompete those 2 plus ions. We see the same with calcium as well. So we see as potassium levels increase, we're seeing a decreasing trend in the uptake of calcium. And potassium also will outcompete sodium as well. Sodium is a big atom, and so potassium can outcompete sodium in terms of its nutrients uptake. In terms of fertilizing potassium, one always follows soil test recommendations. Because when we look at this study that looks at putting on just 120 below that soil test recommendation and following the soil test recommendation and going above the soil test recommendation, looking at a 3-year study, what we see here is pretty much that soil test recommendation of 240 pounds of K2O pretty much was adequate to maintain our yields. So it was not economical for us to be spending money to put on a lot more K than that was recommended by soil tests. Talk about manure management, and a lot of the guys on the panel talk about using manure. There's some things we got to think about when we use manure, is that manure supplies many nutrients, but it's usually not in the required ratio that the alfalfa uses it. So we have to, with good practice, is to test our manure and knows that nutrient composition, so we know exactly how much nutrients we're putting on and know can compute those ratios.
What's usually too high?
Well, the most manure in terms of are pretty much going to have almost, depends on if it's beef or the source of the manure, or dairy. But it's in terms of your nitrogen is, your phosphorus is nitrogen and potassium are almost close, won't be closer together. The phosphorus would be a little lower. So, but most times your nitrogen and potassium levels are close. And then I think most like feedlot manure is 11, 3, 11. So almost similar amount of nitrogen and potassium, and then a little lower phosphorus levels. So when you apply, typically we apply manure a lot based on the nitrogen recommendation. That's how we get that high tonnage when we apply it based on nitrogen recommendation. And because plants use less, on rule, plant uses 10 times more nitrogen as it does phosphorus. So if you put it on based on the nitrogen, you're putting on a lot of phosphorus with it as well. And that's how you end up with phosphorus buildup over time from that manure application. But if you apply it based on phosphorus recommendation, you'll be putting on a lot less tonnage. So it can lead to nutritional problems and can stimulate weeds, as well as if you get too much nitrogen in there, then that could affect nodulation and with your legumes. Excessive K, as we spoke about earlier, can cause cation imbalance in your dairy feed ration, because it can increase that potassium levels. And We can talk about all this, but it all comes back down to soil testing. You gotta know where you stand. And the only way you know where you're standing is with soil test. A soil test will always pay. Because the reason it pays, it saves you from guessing. Because if you don't soil test, you're guessing. And most times, so you don't want to be guessing all the time. It's good to, most soil tests for P and K recommendations, if you focus just on P and K, you're looking at a soil test I like to see every 2 years, but most university recommendation is every 3 to 5 years. So it's not like you're doing it all the time. And using that soil test is you're looking at to make that fertilizer recommendation. So you're looking at your fertilizer rate from none to high and looking at that soil test level from low to high. So if you're in the low range, most recommendations are going to come with what is called a buildup. So you're you're meeting that plant, you're trying to meet that plant requirement for that year, plus you're trying to build that soil up. Because what you're trying to get to is this maintenance level right here. So you're trying to build up to get to that maintenance level. And that's where we want to be, because when you're at this maintenance level, every year all you're just doing is putting on base on removal. So if you produce this much ton, then you're putting that back on based on the amount of nutrients removed each year. And then you get down to, if you get too high, then you're pretty much at a drawdown. So now you're pretty much mining that phosphorus or potassium out of the soil and trying to reduce those levels. Because some of the times, we always think of nutrients deficiency hurting us, but we never think of nutrients toxicity. Sometimes too much of one nutrient can have just a detrimental effect on your yield as having too little. And so a lot of times we always think on the deficiency side and not on the toxicity side. With that, I'll take any questions.
I'm just a little bit curious. I'm not trying to pin you to the wall or put you on the spot, but I've always kind of been led to believe like the high pH stuff, and alfalfa will take the higher pH stuff, even in the 8, pretty well, and because it likes calcium, it uses a lot of calcium. And I've been hearing from you a little bit, and also from Don earlier, that they're showing some pretty significant studies that it's dropping yield, once it gets above 7.5, and definitely, getting up to the 8s. And I'm just wondering if calcium is the only issue there, if that is getting to be a problem.
Okay,
You guys are seeing,
most calcium, because when you get up to pH of 8 and start 8, what you have is calcium bicarbonates.
Okay.
So you're having a lot of calcium bicarbonates. That doesn't mean that all that calcium is available to that plant. So that's where you need hydrogen. If you're getting good water and good hydrogen in the system, because what that acid is going to do is break down that bicarbonate and makes that calcium available. So in that case, you won't see much effect there. But if you're not getting that good water and getting those acid into the system, you're going to start to see a decrease in your yields.
Yeah. I mean, many times with the high pH soil, there's more than just the calcium there that causes problems.
No, you have some of your iron and your other nutrients that's getting tied up as well. But if we think of how a soil is formed, the way a soil is formed is that rock is the acid that does it. It's the acid that breaks those minerals down and make those nutrients available. So that's why areas that has more rainfall, they have more acidic soils. Because the acid comes in, it breaks that minerals down, makes those nutrients available. You get rainfall, and it washes it out. And so they're left with most of the hydrogen. And what's hurting the fertility is not so much the hydrogen, but the lack of the calcium, the magnesium, and those basic nutrients in that system. When you get to a high pH soil, you don't have enough, you're not getting enough moisture in there. You have more OH, so you're getting that OH negative there, and not getting enough hydrogen in the system to really break down those minerals to make those nutrients available.
That makes sense.
Nodules, I've dug up quite a few roots and you can't find nodules I've grown 8 ton plus hay.
Is that because there's sufficient nitrogen there?
That would be the first place I would start. It would be you have adequate nitrogen.
Is that a negative effect if it's not producing the nodules?
I wouldn't see it as a negative effect, because if I'm able to supply it with adequate nitrogen, and the efficiency of that plant actually goes up because it doesn't have to put energy into putting those nodules, so you actually get better response in terms of yield if you have that nitrogen. That's why if we could fertilize a lot of it is economics. And if we can fertilize these legumes actually and put the nitrogen to it, we could increase yield because they won't have to put all that energy into that nodulation. But the economics that goes with that, why spend the money to get it to do it to put the nitrogen on when we can get it to do it itself? And so that comes down to economics. And as well as we have to feed it with P and K because it needs a lot of P and K. Yeah.
I'm not putting that in nitrogen other than what's in the manure.
Yeah. But our soils here are good. Most of the soils in this region, they store good. They hold nitrogen pretty well because you don't have a whole lot of potential for loss once you get it in the soil. Apart because we don't have the rainfall to leach a lot of our nitrogen, so it stays there. And alfalfa is deep rooted, so it can go down and get a lot of that nitrogen deep in the profile.
Hey, Jay, there's been a lot of work done with improved strains of bacteria, re-inoculation, and particularly ground that hasn't been in alfalfa for a long time. It's extremely important to make sure that seed is re-inoculated.
Yes, that's very important to make sure you have the right strain of inoculum on those seeds during establishment.
What about fertilizing, putting cement on for a new stand of alfalfa? Would you recommend that or not? Or
Starter. For me, my philosophy is you do your best job to establish the crop. That's first, because if you don't establish, you don't get a good stand, you don't get a good establishment. You're already starting with a yield deficit. So you want to start out with the highest yield potential you possibly can. And so for me, I would put a starter down for a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of, depends on soil test in terms of phosphorus and potassium. But I want to give it a little bit of starter to get it the best possible start that I can give it. And that's mainly because I want to start at the highest yield potential that I possibly can start at. And so that's where I would focus. I would put a little bit of starter in on, not too much still. Yeah, but I would do that.
In sandy soils, are there any of the micronutrients that can become a problem?
In a sandy soil, a lot of nutrients can become a problem. Because if you think, what you got to think of with your soil is, if you think of a battery, think of soils are like a battery. A sandy soil is a small battery that doesn't hold a lot of charge. So you got to recharge it pretty often. And so that's what you're working with in a sandy soil. So it requires you got to pay a lot more attention to it in terms of its nutrients, and you got to spoon feed it a little more compared to if you start getting into your finer texture soil like your silt loams and your loamy soils. Those are getting a bigger and bigger battery. So those will hold nutrients a lot more. So your chance for deficiency and the holding nutrients would decrease somewhat as you get into your more fine textured soil. So, but a lot of that comes down to soil tests and the organic matter levels in that sandy soils. Because that's what organic matter levels is most. When you think of soils and you have a problem with it, you ask me, how do you fix it? I'm going to tell you, increase organic matter. If you can increase organic matter, you can fix a lot of problems.
And I know in wheat that sometimes they say that sulfur can be a deficiency. Is sulfur also sometimes a deficiency in alfalfa?
Yes, sulfur. Now, sulfur, we're seeing more sulfur deficiency than what we previously used to see. I mean, we have done a wonderful job in cleaning up the air, and now we got clean air, and all that is good. But because of that, we're not getting as much sulfur input into the system, so we're starting to see a lot more sulfur deficiency than what we normally see. So we tend to recommend a lot more sulfur than we ever used to recommend sulfur.
So on sandy soil, you see even bigger results from fertilizing after each day compared to fertilizing the whole.
Yes, you would.
And the more important thing with sandy soil compared to other soil.
Yes, that would be what he's saying is more frequent application on a sandier soil compared to a finer texture soil, and you'll see better response. Because with sandier soil, you want to be spoon feeding that nutrients. So that's where you want to know what your CEC is on your soil, because your CEC tells you how big your battery is. So if you have a low CEC soil, it tells you that means your battery is pretty low, so that means you need more frequent. It's not going to hold a lot of nutrients, so you got to put less nutrient on, but more frequently. And as your CEC gets higher, then you can put less you don't have to put on as often. The challenge with high CEC, if it gets low, then it's a nightmare to bring it back up. That's why you try not to get those. So you get in your silty clay loams and your clay loams, and their nutrient levels get too low. It's really hard to build them back up. So you try to maintain those at there.
It's harder for the nutrients to move through.
Well,
Why is it harder to build that up?
Well, it's the buffer capacity of those soils are a lot higher. So it takes a longer time for them to lose the nutrients. They hold nutrients better, but when you drain them down, it's just like having a big battery. It takes longer to charge than a smaller battery, and kind of the same with those soils.
Any other questions for?
Yeah, on the starter fertilizer, you're talking about the alfalfa, did you put that in row with the seed?
I mean, I would put a little bit down with the seed. I like to put starter down. You guys probably get that now. I like to put starter down because I'm always trying to get out to the best possible start that I can. So when it comes to, most of the times, I like to put in sulfur, nitrogen and sulfur, and then soil test if my zinc levels. So I like to put starter down. So I like that.
Start with your thing on without rating on burning the seed or something.
I mean, we typically want to put less than 10 pounds. You don't want to put a whole lot on there. So with nitrogen, you don't want to put too much because of the salt effects. And phosphorus, you can go a little higher.
And anybody that's ever raised alfalfa knows your stand never gets any better than the first day it comes out.
Yeah. So and that's why it's so important to. Most of my background is mainly from I grew up mainly rice actually. So I was from the University of Missouri where I worked a lot in rice, and my main goal was getting the best stand that I possibly can. And I put everything into making sure that when it comes up, I have a good stand. And I think that started me off in a good position.